They're not attacks on an acronym. They're not attacks on a concept. You can call it diversity, equity, inclusion. You can call it equality, you can call it civil rights, name it whatever you want. These are the core values that enable our country to move forward. They're the core values that enable people to create the future for themselves that they want, to create the future for their children or for future generations that they want. We don't see the American people giving up on those values.
Welcome to The Stakes. I'm Brad Rourke with the Charles F. Kettering Foundation. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan operating foundation that focuses on advancing and defending inclusive democracy. Today, I'm talking to Skye Perryman, who's president and CEO of Democracy Forward. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Skye, what is Democracy Forward?
Democracy Forward is a national legal organization that seeks to use the law in a way to advance a bold and vibrant democracy for all people. We do that through legal cases. We do that through regulatory work. We also do that through a lot of public communications and education work like we're doing here today. We're nonpartisan. We welcome everyone that has an unabashed commitment to people, communities, and to our democracy. We're a Democracy Forward Foundation, is a 501c3 organization, and we are just really pleased to be with you all here today.
The new administration has moved surprisingly fast to implement a number of executive orders that have many experts alarmed by how they operate outside of established law. They even seem to go outside of the constitutional system of checks and balances. Democracy Forward, which you run, has been involved in some of the lawsuits that have been pushing back on these orders and policies. What are the most important cases to be watching right now?
Well, I think there are so many because this is an administration that has said it wants to govern by shock and awe. And I think you see civil society, which is, the groups like mine at Democracy Forward, and also actors like the state attorneys general, really trying to meet that moment and in large part meeting that moment in court. I think there's probably some buckets of cases to follow. There are a number of things that the president has sought to do by executive order with the stroke of a pen that are an offense to our Constitution. That is something like birthright citizenship or some of the other orders that you see that really are so broad and go beyond what a president can do in this country. And so that's one bucket. And I put the anti-DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility executive orders. They are very broad. They are very vague. They are harmful and they violate the First Amendment. We won, and we'll talk about this, we won a court order on that already. And so I would put sort of in one bucket the types of things that the president is seeking to do that are an offense to the individual rights that Americans have by virtue of our Constitution. Then there's a bucket, which is the president's attempt and this administration's attempt to undermine the foundations of our federal government. We all want government to operate efficiently and effectively, and everybody believes government at all levels, federal, state, local, can do a lot better in that respect. But this administration is doing something much different. It's seeking to implement policies that really are seeking to destroy the ability of our government to function for people in a nonpartisan and in an independent way. So individuals who work for the federal government as civil servants, public servants, they work in Republican administrations, they work in Democratic administrations, they leave their politics at home. There is an attack on the independence of the civil service. You're seeing that with attempts to mass fire a number of our public servants, to replace them with political loyalists. You're also seeing a range of attempts to undermine federal agencies that Congress has set up, whether that is the Department of Education or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau or elements of the State Department and the USAID. And that's sort of this good government category I would put in. I think you've got to watch those cases. We have a number of cases there and have won some good early victories there, but there's a lot to do. Mm-hmm. And then I think there is another bucket of cases, which is really the president's policy agenda. Some pieces of that agenda may be lawful, but what we've seen is a number of the policies and the agendas that have been proposed are really, they're unlawful, they're harmful, they're inconsistent actually with what the vast majority of Americans want, including conservatives, liberals, and independents. We're involved in all of those in some way, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But I think that the courts really are this front line where you're seeing a lot of this stuff come to play and become exposed. Within that agenda, you also have that the Doge situation, which is obviously and I think quite concerning to the American public, and that's really in that sort of good government category.
Let's go to that first bucket you talked about that are highly concerning. And you mentioned an important case that's against the so-called anti-DEIA executive orders, which is more than one. Recently, a judge halted implementation of those orders. You were part of that suit. What does this mean, and what's next?
Well, I think the first thing it means, and we want people to understand, we hear from everybody. We hear from people all over the country. People live in big cities, small towns, people that are a little more conservative, people a little more liberal, and people are very concerned about what's happening and what they're seeing. And one thing we want you to know is that the courts are an important front line right now, and that if the president is doing something that he cannot do, you have courts stopping this, pausing it, issuing court orders, and that's what we got in this diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility matter, where the president's executive orders really seek to penalize people and seek to condition federal funding or other types of sort of federal support on adherence to a particular ideology, right? The president's been very clear. He and his administration, they are not fans of what they understand to be diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility. They may have their views, but in the United States, the government doesn't get to engage in what we call viewpoint discrimination, doesn't get to force everyone else to have those same views. And so that was one of the big pieces of this case, was a First Amendment piece. They also violated a range of other federal protections that are alleged in the case that we'll hear more from. But that is where it is. So a judge in federal court issued a sweeping nationwide injunction to halt the implementation of those executive orders. This was really important because you saw, agencies like the Department of Justice, Pam Bondi came out with a memo that actually threatened criminal implications and criminal penalties around some of the certifications with respect to DEIA. So, I mean, this is a very important order. The government is appealing that order. And so we will be watching for the next stages. We'll be litigating. Our lawyers are actively litigating that case in federal court in Maryland.
The case itself, you brought it forward, but on behalf of the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, the American Association of University Professors, and the Restaurant Opportunity Centers United. This is a coalition that aren't all of like kind. Talk a little bit about what kind of lift it is to get something like that organized.
Well, and then the other plaintiff in that case is also the City of Baltimore, which is really important.
Oh, I failed to mention,
No, but cities and communities have a lot at stake too. So I think this is just such a moment for our country, and there is a lot at stake regardless of who you are, what profession you may be in, what community you may be from. And so it's important in our cases that our cases really represent the voices of so many people in our country. And so I'll talk about some of the logistics of it, but as you pointed out, we were really honored that we have, university professors and people who seek to make higher education and college education more accessible. That they're a great part of the case, because these orders are, really striking at the heart of a lot of what education is overall, and certainly education in higher education. But it's really important. We also represent the Restaurant Opportunity Centers, which is restaurant workers. And, this executive order would be harmful to working Americans, to people that are standing on their feet for hours a day, serving their communities, and attacks on diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility. They are attacks on those workforces as well. And so, whether you're a university professor or a restaurant worker, the First Amendment is yours. And then, of course, the City of Baltimore has such a rich history in and of itself, of racial strife, of racial progress. So many of the communities within the Baltimore area depend on core federal programs and federal initiatives that are designed to make our country a place for everybody, not just for some people. And so being able to bring Baltimore in to that case was also great. In terms of how you get that done, a lot of it is really finding the commonality. People may be different, communities may be different, organizations may be run differently, but guess what? They are all united in their commitment to the First Amendment and their commitment to a country that is able to move forward and not just trying to hold on to what we are now or to keep us from moving backward. And so it's really been an honor to see those voices come together in the case.
Do you think the administration was prepared for how fast the suits came?
I don't think they were. They came out and said that they wanted to govern by shock and awe. And I think what they didn't know is that for months, civil society groups that have a lot at stake, people and communities across this country that may disagree on certain issues, but that are all aligned in our love for the country, in the need for people's rights to be protected, had been working really hard together. And so at Democracy Forward, we have been honored to resource and to launch a project known as Democracy 2025, which of course folks that are tuning in can go to democracy2025.org to learn more, where we really got everybody that has a stake in our country together and said, we hope that if this administration comes in, that they will govern for all of us. But if they don't, and if they seek to implement an increasingly extreme political agenda that really strikes at the heart of what makes us what makes our country great and special, that we would be able to respond. And that's what we've done. We've seen a number of news reports out about how the administration is struggling to keep up in court. That's very interesting, given that the federal government is much larger, of course, than any of our groups together.
Shift gears slightly. Last week was the deadline that was laid down by the Department of Education, which wrote a Dear Colleague letter telling colleges and universities that they'd have to stop teaching that includes diversity or inclusion or lose federal funding. You're part of a suit that's pushing back on that too. Where does it stand? What's next?
Yeah, so we filed a suit last week, another quick suit. This is another one where we're really proud of the diversity of plaintiffs that we have in the case. And in this case, we're representing the American Federation of Teachers. So in many instances, those educators are also K through 12 educators and then also higher education educators. And then the American Sociological Association. This Dear Colleague letter, this new policy that the Department of Education has put out, we believe it is unlawful, but more than that, it is harmful. It is seeking to really undermine the equalizing factor that we have in education, the way in which education in this country can help make communities stronger, can help us be in touch with our history. I would encourage your listeners, if you haven't looked at the Dear Colleague letter, to go look at it. It came out on February 14th. It wasn't much of a Valentine for people that care about democracy, but it's a February 14th Dear Colleague letter. You can learn more on the democracy4.org website about the suit. But even reading it, I think it just doesn't sit well with people because it is another attempt to impose an ideology on everyone in this country. And that's unlawful. They're not attacks on an acronym. They're not attacks on a concept. I mean, you can call it diversity, equity, inclusion. You can call it equality. You can call it civil rights. You can name it whatever you want. But what this is really about is these are the core values that enable our country to move forward. They're the core values that enable people to create the future for themselves that they want, to create the future for their children or for future generations that they want. We don't see the American people giving up on those values. And so we are really calling on institutions of higher education, all educational institutions, other institutions in society, to summon their courage, to live consistent with their values, and to use the court process. We know that many of these things are unlawful. The courts are going to hold them to be unlawful. And we think that's a really important piece of this. And we're so honored to be working with such brave clients that are challenging this.
Skye Perryman, President and CEO of Democracy Forward, thanks for being here.
Thank you.